Welcome to our sleepless sanctuary. You enter at your own risk and choose to be entertained with dark and disturbing horror stories. You have been warned. For the dark hours when you dare not close your eyes. Tales of horror to frighten and disturb. Join us as the sleepless hours tick past. Brace yourself for the No Sleep Podcast. Welcome to the No Sleep Podcast Sanctuary. I'm David Cummings. Our service this week features tales about those things from the past which ceaselessly haunt us. This week I'll have the pleasure of going to the Pacific Northwest as I head to Seattle for PodCon, the weekend of January 19 and 20. This is a convention not just for those who make podcasts, but for the fans of podcasts as well. It's not too late to get tickets if you're in the area. I'll be on a panel discussing the craft of voice acting, and I'll be doing a podcast along with Drew Ackerman of the Sleep With Me podcast. We'll combine a sleepless no-sleep story with Drew's sleep-inducing delivery to see if people will be lulled into sleep or into terror. And if you're planning to be at PodCon, please say hi if you see me wandering the convention center floor. I'll have some swag with me like postcards, pins, and maybe even some t-shirts to give away. There will be a link in the show notes if you want to learn more about PodCon in Seattle next weekend. But if you're a fan of this podcast and can't make it to Seattle, we still have lots of treats for you. Namely, this episode. And now, it's time for our service to begin. Bow your heads and hear our words. In our first tale, we meet a man who recalls the summer when he was 12 years old. As author René Wren shares, the boy enjoyed spending the summer away from the city and getting to know his elderly neighbors. It was only later that he realized not everything was as idyllic as he thought. Performing this tale are Jeff Clement and Erica Sanderson. So don't kid around while you listen to The Case of the Bassinet Children.
As kids, we often miss the obvious. It is only as adults that we catch on to certain events in our childhood. It was the same for me during a specific summer vacation in my childhood. Only now do I realize what happened back then. At the time of this story, I was 12 years old. I was a city kid, but my parents would spend the summer at their holiday home. It was not as fancy as it might sound. It wasn't much more than a small cabin located near town. I loved the wild plains, the forests, the farms, and many other rural things. At times, I played soccer or other games with the local kids. At others, I went on little adventures. What I enjoyed the most was to ride my bike for hours on end. I'd often follow the many dirt roads and paths that led here and there to see where I'd end up. One day, during another long bike ride, I met a friendly old couple. They seemed to be hiking along the dirt road in my direction. As soon as the old woman noticed me, she gave me a warm greeting. They reminded me of my grandparents, so I smiled and I waved to them. When I had passed them and was going to ride on, the old woman called out to me.
"Oh, my, you can't go any further, little boy. You'll end up in the swamps." Better turn around.
I looked ahead and could already see that the dirt road seemed to become muddy. I nodded towards the old lady and thanked her for the warning. I turned my bike around, drove back toward them, and soon enough ended up talking with them for a bit. They'd been hiking and berry picking in the area nearby and were on their way back home. Their house was out here, near the edge of the forest and not too far ahead. They said they preferred it out here, away from the bustle of town. When they asked me about myself, I told them where I was from and that I was only here on vacation for some weeks. It wasn't long before we arrived at a big old house, nestled perfectly into the trees that made up the edge of the forest. As we continued on, the old lady asked me if I'd come with them and if I wanted something to drink or maybe a snack. I thanked her but shook my head. The sun would be setting soon. If I was late again, I'd be in trouble with my mom. When I got home, my parents were already waiting for me to get dinner ready. I don't know why, but I never told them about the old couple I met. Or I just forgot to mention them. It was a few days later that I found myself on the same dirt road as before. I hesitated for a moment, but then I thought I might as well pay them a visit. As I approached the house, I saw that they were sitting outside in a Hollywood swing. I waved and greeted them. As soon as she recognized me, the old lady was ecstatic to see me, got up and walked towards me.
My, oh my, guess who's come back, Herbert?
Her husband didn't move from the swing.
What brings you back here to us boring old folks?
I was a little shy as a kid, so when they both spoke to me so openly, I couldn't help but cast my eyes down. I answered in a quiet voice that I was nearby and thought it was the proper thing to say hello.
Now, aren't you a well-mannered young boy?
Now then, you want to sit down for a bit, boy?
Herbert motioned towards the now empty spot on the swing. After leaning my bike against a tree, I went over and sat down right next to him. His wife, whose name was Elsa, watched us for a bit. Then, nodding and beaming, she went inside. It wasn't long before my small talk with Herbert turned to birds and forest animals. It had been a lifelong interest of his ever since he was a little boy. After some time, he asked me if I had ever seen any forest animals for real, like a badger, a deer, a fox, or even just a rabbit. I guess he remembered I was from the city. I told him that I had, but only from afar, or in one of the animal parks. Herbert laughed and said that I was in for a treat. With that, he got up and motioned for me to come along. He led me into the house, up the stairs, and opened the door to a big room. As I stepped inside after him, my eyes grew wide. The room was filled with all sorts of forest animals and birds. For a moment, I cringed back, but soon I noticed that none of them were moving. Herbert explained that I needn't be afraid. Those were all stuffed, or better, preserved animals. In younger years, he had earned a living by doing this. He had been a taxidermist. I remember that it felt a little weird to stay in a room surrounded by all these dead animals. Herbert let me look around for a moment, and then started to tell me a bit about each of the different animals. Soon enough, my uneasiness at their sight vanished as I listened to his explanations. We'd gone through almost all the animals when the old man and I heard Elsa call out from downstairs.
Herbert, come help me in the kitchen, won't you?
I could see how Herbert's expression changed and grew dark for a moment.
Well, better look what she did this time. Shouldn't take too long.
With that, he went out the door. I looked around some more and touched the preserved animals and their fur, if only to make sure that they really weren't alive. Most imposing of all animals was a male deer with a huge pair of antlers on his head. At first, I only stared at the majestic animal, but soon I reached out for the antlers. It wasn't long before Herbert came back and saw me near the deer and told me all about this specific animal. Looking back, I think that old Herbert was happy that I was so interested in his preserved animals. In time, he led me back outside. With a laugh, he told me that we'd spent so much time up in the animal room that it was already getting late. I said goodbye to Herbert, and after waving to Elsa, I was on my way back home. That night, it took me a long time to fall asleep. My thoughts and dreams revolved all around the forest animals Herbert had shown me and told me about. The next day, right after lunch, I went out with my bike and drove straight to their house again. As I arrived, it was only Elsa who was there. She was sitting on the swing, busying herself with a bouquet of flowers. Her face lit up in an instant when she saw me and waved me over. She told me Herbert wasn't around and had gone on one of his solitary walks through the forest. After listening to her for a bit, I asked her with downcast eyes if I could see the preserved animals again.
Oh, of course you can, my dear little boy.
It felt weird holding hands with her, but again, I was too shy to say anything. As she led me up the stairs and into the room, she babbled on and on without end.
Why don't you come?
Even after we entered the room, she kept talking about herself and how happy she was that I was back.
Say, would you like to see something else?
Without even waiting for an answer, she told me with a big smile on her face that it was the old playroom of their kids.
You'll be sure to enjoy it. Oh, yes, it'll be just your thing.
A little annoyed, but also a bit curious, I followed her. What Elsa led me to was a room that was almost as big as Herbert's animal room. Elsa was right. A playroom it was. There were toys everywhere. I was taken aback at the sheer number. The room was filled to the brim with wooden blocks, puppets, dolls, teddy bears, toy cars, trains, and much, much more.
It's fine. Go ahead. You can play with anything you want.
I looked at her for a moment and then stepped into the room and looked around awkwardly. I was already 12 years old, and most of the toys there seemed to be for younger kids. I couldn't bring myself to say anything to Elsa, though. As I walked further into the room, she told me she'd be back in a while, and I should enjoy myself for the time being. Soon after Elsa was gone, I left the playroom too. It was so boring. As I walked back in the direction of the animal room, I saw that one of the other doors in the hallway was slightly ajar. First, I only peeked inside, but didn't see anything since it was almost pitch black in the room. A quick glance around showed me that I was alone, and so I opened the door a little more. I was finally able to see that a variety of cribs and beds filled the room. A big black curtain covered the only window. As I stepped inside, I noticed someone sitting in one of the beds. I jumped back and almost screamed. My first thought was that someone was sleeping in one of the beds. Soon enough, I realized whatever it was wasn't moving at all. I laughed a little as I realized my mistake. What was sitting in the bed must have been a puppet or a big doll. Only moments later, I noticed in the half shade of the room that there were more of them. A whole assortment of these dolls were sitting or lying in the beds and cribs all around. Each of the cribs and beds had a nameplate attached to its front end. Here was Sam, followed by Peter and Marcel, then Tom, and on it went. I moved toward the bed with the name Sam on it to have a closer look. As I touched the puppet's arm, it felt weird. The skin was almost too soft and didn't feel like cloth. I was a little weirded out, but soon my thoughts went from the doll to a little box sitting at the foot end of the bed. As I picked it up, I realized it was wooden. The name Sam was written on it in fine letters, same as on the nameplate. In the dark of the room, it took me a bit, but soon I found the lid and tried opening it.
Hey,
I rushed out of the room, and only when I was on my way did I realize I was still holding the box. Not knowing what to do and hearing Elsa's footsteps coming up the stairs, I put it in my backpack. I told myself I'd return it later. I met up with Elsa, who led me to the downstairs kitchen. She had prepared a glass of fresh lemonade and a little bowl of fruits.
You must be thirsty, aren't you?
It was then that Herbert, still wearing a pair of stout hiking boots, entered the room.
Well, that's...
He stopped when he saw Elsa and me with the glass of lemonade. His gaze rested on me for a moment. Then he went forward to Elsa with a sad expression on his face.
Elsa, your diabetes. The doctor said...
Oh, Herbert, no, it's for the boy. He's going...
Elsa, no. You know you can't keep doing this. It's no good.
With that, he went closer towards his old wife, who was still holding the glass and the bowl of snacks. She looked first at him, then at me, then at him again, before tears started streaming from her eyes.
It's all right, Elsa.
I didn't understand what was going on at all. Finally, Herbert turned to me and told me that today wasn't a good day. I nodded and went to go, wondering what exactly had just happened and what was wrong with Elsa. I spent the rest of the day in town with some of my friends, and soon I had completely forgotten what had happened. In the evening, as I was getting ready for bed, my mom found the wooden box that was still in my backpack. I'd forgotten to put it back. Soon I found myself explaining to my mom how I had come into possession of the box. I told her about the sweet old couple I'd gotten to know and where I had met them. Then I rambled on about Herbert's preserved animals. Lastly, I told her where I had found the box. I remembered that her face turned serious as she listened to me. Then she sent me to bed. That night, I was awoken by people arguing. As I left the small bedroom of our holiday cottage, I found my mom in tears and my dad talking to many other people. When he noticed me, he sent me back to bed right away and assured me that everything was all right. The next day, though, they told me we had to go back home. I never found out what actually had been going on that night. To tell you the truth, I had almost completely forgotten about the whole thing. I found out the truth by accident. I was going through the library's archive for a university project. There, I stumbled upon an old newspaper clipping. Going through year after year, something had caught my eye. The case of the bassinet children. Old couple found guilty in missing children case. The article talked about a bizarre and gruesome discovery at the home of an elderly couple. I started to skim it out of sheer boredom, but soon I read the names: Herbert and Elsa. It took a while, but then I remembered the old couple from my summer vacation. The date of the story was from about a decade ago, the same summer I had met them. At first I told myself it was a coincidence, but soon I couldn't deny the truth anymore. Through the decades, the old couple had killed at least 12 children of varying age. The police found the proof right in their house. It was the mostly preserved bodies of their 12 victims. As I read the word taxidermist, it clicked. Right then I realized what the room I snuck into must have been. I remembered how wrong the doll had felt. I shivered as I realized where I'd been back then. In a room filled with the preserved corpses of all those children. I called my mom soon after. At first, she vehemently feigned ignorance, but then she told me what she and my dad had found in the box that same night. Inside, they had found pieces of memorabilia and a number of photographs. At first, it was just photos of a kid outside, either alone or with a lady that must have been in her 50s. They were normal enough at first. Soon enough, though, there were photos of the boy unconscious and naked. She said the rest of the pictures were too much for her. She said they had called the police then and there. The couple was arrested that same night without any resistance. Herbert gave himself up. Elsa didn't understand what was going on. It was attributed to her suffering from an early stage of dementia. In a later article, I found Herbert's testimony. They never had children, he said. Medical issues. His wife never got over the fact. She loved children over everything. Since she couldn't have her own, this love soon became an obsession. Elsa would often invite kids to her house, play with them, and give them snacks. One day, though, she went further and drugged a little boy. He never woke up again. Elsa pleaded for Herbert not to take her baby away, to never take him off of her. Herbert said, seeing and hearing his wife like that, he knew something had to be done about the body. Shaking his head, he admitted to a thing he should never have done. That was only the first one. Herbert knew she was sick, but there was nothing else he could do to protect her, and he'd never report her. I stopped reading there. The whole story made me too sick to continue digging into it. There is one thing I think about a lot these days. How close I must have been to becoming one of these kids. How did I get away? Was I lucky? At these times, I think about Herbert's behavior and what he told his wife that afternoon. I can't help but think that it was all thanks to the old man that I am still alive today.
Trying to reconnect with old high school friends is usually easy these days thanks to social media. But as author Meg Malloy explains, if a friend isn't on social media, it can be hard to track them down. And like the man in this story, it can be difficult to know if your old friend really is who they say they are. Performing this tale are Graham Rowett, Addison Peacock, and Kyle Akers. So if you recognize the person, it should be okay, right? Especially if they're the spitting image.
Hi, Rebecca. It's David Harrison from high school. I don't know if this is your current email address, but since you don't have Facebook, I figured this was my best shot. I'm sad we never kept in contact after I moved, but I want to let you know that I was moving back to Harker's Island. If you're still in the area, I'd love to catch up. I signed the email and hovered over the send button for a moment before clicking. I'd never intended to come back to the town where I grew up. If anything, I was trying my damnedest to stay away. Don't get me wrong, it's nice. But it's nice in the same way that the vast majority of coastal towns in the South are nice. Nothing in the grand scheme of things makes it special. There's nothing specifically wrong with it either, but my opinion was tainted by memories of going to school there. I didn't have a lot of friends. I wasn't good at sports or academics or anything, really. The only reason I put up with going to that school was Rebecca Cavendish. She was weird, too. Got picked on a little for her obsessive interest in dolphins, but she was beautiful, and she was funny, and she was the only girl who ever spoke to me. We would sit next to each other on the bus over the bridge to the mainland every day without fail, and we'd just talk. She told me about how she wanted to go into aquaculture and take over her dad's oyster farm, but her grades weren't good enough to get her into the specialized marine sciences school in Moorhead. I told her about my parents' divorce, how my mom and dad kept getting into arguments about who would get to keep the cats, and who would have to take care of me. When she was 16 and she got a tattoo on a whim while her parents were out of town, I was one of the only people who she showed it to. It was a dolphin, just like the ones on her trapper keeper and favorite jacket, and she kept it hidden from the teachers with a mix of long sleeves and makeup. When she showed it to me, I told her it was badass. We didn't have any classes together, and we weren't even in the same grade, but she meant everything to me. I always thought she felt the same way. But then I moved with my dad to Atlanta in my final year, and somehow Rebecca and I just fell apart. She never wrote. She never called. She never reached out to me on social media once that became a thing people did. When I wrote that email, I was sitting at the desk in my new apartment. It was a studio, way on the outskirts of town where I could actually afford it. My desk was right by a window that I always kept unshuttered. I went to my desk and checked for a response in my inbox every day for a week. Nothing ever happened, and I always just ended up staring hatefully out at the sky. That's what I was doing when she showed up. Rebecca, or at the very least, someone who looked exactly like she had the last time I saw her. Exactly is maybe too strong a word. She had different hair. I recalled it being brown, but now it was neon turquoise. She had a few more piercings in her ears, eyebrow, and one nostril. But other than that, she looked identical, like she hadn't aged at all since she was 17. We made eye contact. There was no recognition in the way she looked at me. I was fixated on that for the rest of the day. Was that Rebecca? Did she not remember me? Around 3 p.m., I went outside and walked back and forth past all the other apartments, looking at the front windows through my peripherals. I caught a shock of that neon turquoise through the blinds of number 4. Of course, I couldn't just knock on her door. I couldn't impose on her like that. I'd never been one to impose on others. So what I did was I broke into her mailbox. I don't know if she'd even have mail yet, but if she did, her name would be on it. I took a couple of pins and a screwdriver, looked up a YouTube tutorial, and went out.
Tampering with another person's mail is a federal offense.
I turned around, and she was there. Freshly rolled cigarette hanging limply from the fingers of her left hand as she looked down her nose at me. I was surprised. I hadn't expected her to sound like that. My memory of Rebecca in high school involved a soft, airy voice with a fairly neutral accent. But this new her, or not her, the woman standing here in front of me now and smoking, she sounded different. It was undoubtedly similar to Rebecca's voice, but there was an unfamiliar, harsh edge to it. A bass line of sarcastic vitriol delivered with a lilt I couldn't place. I didn't respond right away. I just stared at the cigarette and wondered if Rebecca was left-handed. I'm sorry, There was no way to justify what I was doing. I put the pin and screwdriver back into my jacket. After that, I stood up and stepped back from the mailbox.
Relax. I don't give a shit. Legality is a construct.
Everything she said sounded like it bored her terribly. She squinted and looked me over. I live in number 6. My name's David.
You very much do, and it very much is.
There was a long silence while she continued to smoke. Finally, I extended a hand. And you are? She looked at it like I was holding a live tarantula out towards her, then raised her own hand. She appeared to really think it over, ultimately deciding not to shake with me. I got a good look. Her hands were beautiful, just like the rest of her. The only odd thing was the amount of dirt on her fingernails. I tried to sneak a peek at her upper arm to see if the dolphin tattoo was visible. She sensed me looking and crossed her arms close to her body.
Forgive me for not being forthcoming.
She quirked a brow.
You were just going through my mail, so I think it's more than sensible for me to assume you would be the type to stalk my socials.
I'm not, You look exactly like my friend from high school who I haven't spoken to in years, and I can't tell if you've just aged really well and forgotten about me, or if you're just some weirdly identical relative. Trying to say it out loud just didn't feel right.
Look, Davy Jones, you seem mostly alright. But if I see you digging around in my shit again, I will bring hell down upon you. Do you understand?
I couldn't quite parse the way she chose to put sentences together. She kind of sounded like a character from a 60s B movie who'd gotten lost. Sure. I began backing away towards my door. Not quite Rebecca held eye contact and finished her cigarette. I could have left well enough alone at this point, but of course I didn't. If she wouldn't tell me her name, I had to go back and find out. I left it until 3 a.m., when any reasonable human, myself excluded, would logically have been sleeping. All I was going to do was try the mail slot for number 4 again, look at one of the envelopes, and leave. If it said Rebecca Cavendish, I'd try and engage. If it didn't, I'd leave her alone. It was a very simple plan. It should have been, anyway. I picked the lock, the same way I'd been planning on doing when she'd interrupted me. Slowly, I reached into the slot, trying my damnedest not to make any noise, and I pulled out an envelope. To the tenant of apartment 4, it said. I caught myself before I could shout, "What kind of bullshit?" out loud.
They call me the wild rose. My name was Eliza Day.
I was about to grab another one. My hand was back in the slot when I heard it.
And I know Eliza Day.
I pulled out another envelope. To the homeowner. God fucking damn it!
From the first day I saw her, knew she was the one. As she stared in my eyes and smiled.
My ears perked up. That was a man's voice. That was very clearly a man's voice. It was weird enough that not quite Rebecca was singing in her kitchen at 3 a.m., but now I knew she had someone else in there singing with her. His singing wasn't bad, not at all, but in the context of him being in there with her, it felt like getting stabbed in the ears. I never knew she could sing. She never told me she could sing. Why didn't she ever tell me? Why did this jerk-off, of all people, get to sing with her at ass o'clock in the morning? The light was dim, but I could just make out one figure. Whoever it was looked bigger than Rebecca. A lot bigger. That had to have been him. When he crossed the beam of light coming from the next room, I got the impression he was my height at least, and significantly broader than either myself or Rebecca. He stopped singing and turned towards the window. I ducked. That encounter weighed heavily on me. I stayed up almost until sunrise, mulling it over. I kept trying to remind myself that my new neighbor wasn't for sure Rebecca, but after a certain point, it didn't matter. I could only think of her as Rebecca, my Rebecca, and I couldn't stand the idea of her ghosting me for 10 years only to show up in my life again with a boyfriend and some kind of selective amnesia about who I was. I couldn't tell who I was more mad at, the guy for stealing her or Rebecca for cutting off contact and forgetting about me. When I finally fell asleep, I had a dream where I pushed both of them off a cliff. Seeing not quite Rebecca in the parking lot or the communal laundry room was hell, because I wanted so badly to ask. I wanted to walk up to her, lean casually on something, and very calmly say something about what I'd heard. But obviously, there wasn't anything that I could actually say to her or anybody. So I just hung back, smiled, and nodded, feeling like I was going to explode. She could sense it. While I waited for my dryer cycle to finish, I kept one eye on Rebecca the whole time. She watched the washing machine spin, and her eyes started to glaze over. She yawned. God, for a second her mouth seemed so big. Bigger than it should have been. I squinted, but tried to look like I wasn't paying attention to her. Then she started stretching her neck. You know, moving it from side to side the way you do when your neck gets stiff after sitting or standing in one place for too long. Rebecca's head tilted to one side, then the other. Then it twisted the whole way around. I jumped and nearly slammed into the dryer. I looked back at Rebecca, and her head was completely normal. She was staring at me.
What's up, Slick?
I'm fine. I thought I saw a snake.
You need to smoke some weed or something.
Rebecca rolled her eyes and left the laundry room. A sock fell out of her basket on the way out. I picked it up and thought about giving it back to her. I didn't. The next time I saw Rebecca was while I was taking my trash out. I threw the bag into the dumpster, and she just kind of appeared behind me, ready to swoop in and plunge her arm into the bag I'd just tossed. Once again, her arm was covered by her shirt, and even if it hadn't been, she moved too fast for me to spot the dolphin, if it was even there. She took an apple out of the trash can and bit into it like it was nothing. I cringed. It had brown spots. That's why I'd thrown it out in the first place. I noticed that again, she had very dirty nails.
Waste of a good apple.
The bites she left behind on the surface of the apple seemed weirdly larger than they should have been. It had spots on it, so I didn't want to risk it.
You're everything that's wrong with America.
What's that supposed to mean?
You heard me.
She ate the core.
Food waste is choking the planet. That's why I live zero waste. I'm a freegan.
Is that like being a vegan? She rolled her eyes at me and let out a groan that I felt maybe wasn't warranted.
I eat meat. I eat meat all the time. Just nothing that was killed specifically for the purpose of being eaten.
I wrinkled my nose. What, so like roadkill? That's honestly disgusting.
You don't have to do it if that's how you feel.
She turned the stem over in her fingers, then she ate that too. I didn't know where to take the conversation, so I threw my other trash bag away and went back to my apartment. Everything this girl had done since moving in had been absolutely baffling. None of it felt like Rebecca to me. But then again, people change. I didn't know how the last 10 years had treated her. Badly, it seemed like. Strangely, at the very least. I looked out my window, over the parking lot to where the dumpster was kept. I briefly considered going through the trash for a receipt or an old prescription bottle or something, just for another shot at the name, but I realized there'd be no way to tell if it was hers. I looked out at the dumpster again later, multiple times, just about once every 2 hours. I had Googled freegan. Apparently, these people get most of their food from dumpster diving. I was curious to see if Rebecca would come back to fish anything out of the trash. Something about the idea of her eating more things that I had thrown out felt exciting. I didn't see anyone go out there until about midnight. The shape I saw under the light wasn't Rebecca. It was the man, the big guy I'd seen in her apartment. Without realizing it, I started clenching my fists. He was standing by a car. Her car. Asshole doesn't even have his own car, I thought. What a joke. Probably works at Burger King or some shit. You don't deserve her, you clown. The trunk was open. I still couldn't tell what he looked like, save for the outline of his body and a sliver of dirty, tawny hair that caught the light from the streetlights above the dumpster. He pulled something out of the trunk. Something big, wrapped in a blue tarp. I had a horrible thought, and I tried to push it away. No, that was just a rug, or some kind of weird piece of furniture. I was being stupid, and my brain was being affected by the time of day and the creepy lighting. A human leg slipped out of the folds of the tarp as he hoisted it over his shoulders. Oh, fuck. I thought there was no way he could have heard me, but he must have, because his head snapped upwards towards my window. I slammed my blinds closed. I fell asleep in my chair and didn't wake up until I heard a knock at my door. I got up, wiped drool off the side of my face, and smoothed my hair down before stumbling, disoriented, to the door. When I opened it, there was Rebecca. She had sunglasses on, but I could still feel hate drilling into me from the eyes behind them.
Hey, so stop fucking spying on me.
I'm sorry, Okay, I thought you were someone else. You look exactly like someone I knew in high school.
That's a shitty reason to spy on me.
Well, also, your boyfriend is a hitman or something. Is that a better reason? Why won't you tell me your name? She scowled at me.
Remember what I said about raining hell down on you? Fucking meant it. I don't want to see you again.
We live 2 doors away from each other.
I don't care. Stay in your fucking apartment.
Before she left, I yelled after her, unable to contain my curiosity. Tell me what your boyfriend's doing scuttling around at 3 a.m. in the parking lot. Rebecca glanced around, then turned back to me and gave me a conspiratorial look.
I'm single.
I gaped and watched her leave. I closed the door as she went and bolted back to my computer. I don't know why I didn't do this before. I could have just saved myself the effort and done this first. I Googled Rebecca Cavendish. I got a couple LinkedIn profiles that didn't look like her, and a Facebook account that I'd already confirmed didn't belong to her. I added Harker's Island to the search terms. The first result floored me. Carteret County unveils new library wing in honor of deceased former student. Without even thinking about it, I clicked the link. Today, the Cavendish Reading Room has been officially opened at the Carteret County Public Library in honor of Rebecca Cavendish, the daughter of Harker's Island business owner Fred Cavendish, who tragically passed away 8 years ago. My mouth felt dry. At first I thought, relax, maybe they're related. Maybe this is her sister or her cousin. But deep down I knew that the chances of someone, even a relative, looking that much like Rebecca and living in the same town was slim to none. I want to make the point that I'm not usually a man who believes in supernatural bullshit, but I was struggling to find a solution to this puzzle that didn't involve possession, reanimation, or some creature wearing Rebecca's skin. It had to be one of those things, as crazy as it was to consider. That was the only explanation. That was how she was able to change her voice. Why she was so weirdly flexible. Why she always seemed to have dirt under her nails. Why that guy... No. That was her. Why she had been dragging a dead body up to her apartment. I owned a gun that I kept in a locked safe under my bed. Just an old revolver, nothing over the top. Up until that point, I'd never even gotten it out other than to test it at the gun range. I unlocked the safe and loaded the bullets, wondering how good of a shot I was. I hadn't been to the gun range in a while. Hell, I hadn't even taken the thing out to clean it since I'd left Atlanta. I burst out the door of my apartment and went down the 2 spaces to not Rebecca's. I aimed my gun at the handle. I had to wrestle with the trigger a little bit. It was rusty. God, it really had been ages since I cleaned that fucking thing. The inside of not Rebecca's apartment smelled like rot. I coughed, held my gun with one hand and my nose with the other. You killed Rebecca, didn't you? I walked through the kitchen and stepped on something. I lost my footing for a moment, and when I looked down, I saw that I'd stepped on a bone. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. It looked human, and it was cracked, sucked clean of the marrow. When I stopped to examine the rest of the kitchen, I retched. There were bones everywhere. All picked clean and strewn carelessly over the countertops like the leftovers from a fucking Christmas turkey. I could only assume that this was the person I'd seen the creature carrying the night before. My stomach sank as I briefly considered how many other people had fallen victim to this thing. The bathroom door. I ignored it for the time being, my morbid curiosity driving me towards the refrigerator. I looked over my shoulder, keeping my gun close to my chest, and I opened it. Buried in amongst spotty produce and half-finished containers of putrid-smelling cream cheese, a faded blue Lisa Frank dolphin smiled up at me from a gray, dirt-caked hunk of meat wrapped in clear plastic. I felt bile rising in my throat again and barely made it to the sink. Once I'd more or less regained my senses, I ran to the bathroom and whacked the handle with my gun. The thing was there, looking exactly the same, though with skin that was waxier and fingers that were longer and sharper. It was a perverse vision of Rebecca now, a corrupted imitation of her beauty. It didn't seem scared, not entirely. It wasn't cowering or backing away from me anyway. It had a knife in its hand for protection, and its gaze was fixed on me. I know what you're doing.
David, put the gun down.
No. You did something to Rebecca. You stole her body, and now you're after me.
Who?
I have to admit, that wasn't the response I had expected. Rebecca Cavendish. You killed her to take over her body. I was frantic, jabbing the gun in the air as I spoke.
No, David. I promise I didn't.
Its tone was measured. It was talking to me like it was a hostage negotiator, like I was the one who was dangerous, and not the monster or demon or whatever the fuck it was.
I told you, I consume nothing that was killed specifically for the purpose of being eaten.
Well, forgive me for not believing you. It moved, and I raised the gun up again. You had no problem lying about being human. You would have no problem lying about fucking killing people.
You never directly asked, to be fair.
Don't get smart with me, you sick fucking ghoul! Rebecca's eyebrows both rose.
What gave it away?
Its voice was still Rebecca's, unaltered save for that weird, annoying effect. The sound of it was starting to make my toes curl. Show me what you really look like. Show me! Show me what the fuck you are!
You're so pathetic. How boring is your life? How fucking boring and lonely must your life be that you spend all your time stalking someone just because she looks like a girl who was nice to you in high school? Get a hobby.
You get a hobby! Hearing the thing laugh was even worse than hearing it talk. It was such an ugly, deranged sound, like a pack of hyenas huffing nitrous.
Proved my point. Proved my fucking point. You don't even know if that gun could kill me. By the way, please put it down. The neighbors are going to call the cops on both of us.
I meant to hit the creature's heart, but as I said before, it had been a while since I'd been to a gun range, and my aim was terrible. My bullet clipped the thing's shoulder and went through the wall behind. Something sticky and green oozed out of its fresh wound.
And you're a terrible shot, too.
Don't test me! Son of a bitch.
You don't even take care of your weapon either. Oh my god.
I gritted my teeth. It was bad enough that this thing was probably going to kill me, but did it really have to judge my gun ownership skills on top of that? Shut the fuck up! I held the gun sideways and opened up the barrel. There was some rust in a couple of the chambers. I had no idea why it was that rusty. I quickly wiped it out with my shirt and put the bullets back in before closing it.
Look, David, can you just leave, please?
Shut! As I turned the gun over in my hand again, I fumbled it. Before I had time to register what was happening, I couldn't breathe, and there was a horrible burning pain spreading through my chest cavity. I looked down and saw blood leaking from a fresh bullet hole in my side. I dropped to the ground and crawled to the towel rack, grasping for a towel and uselessly opening and closing my mouth, trying to get as much air from my remaining lung as possible. Shaking, I grabbed a towel and pressed it to my side. The creature, still pretending to be Rebecca, still wearing her goddamn face, crossed the small room and squatted down on the tile next to me. It was looking at me like a cat looking at a fishbowl.
See where paranoia gets you, Davy Jones. You could have left me the fuck alone and we would have gotten on fine. You living your life, me living mine. But no, you had to be a total fucking busybody and ruin everything.
I looked up at the ceiling and sighed.
I have to move again now. Great.
I wish I could have said anything, but all I could do was wheeze impotently and hold the towel to my side. My remaining lung was starting to burn. I couldn't breathe. I tried, but I couldn't breathe at all anymore. I mouthed, "Ambulance." Seeing the distress in my eyes, it grinned, and now I could see for sure that its mouth was way, way too big. There were so many teeth. Its expression was one of realization, of someone who just had the solution to all of their problems handed to them on a silver platter.
Actually,
Its clawed hand hovered over the side where I'd shot myself.
maybe I don't have to.
It reached under my shirt and felt around the bullet hole for a loose piece of skin. I would have screamed if I could. The pain of its nails digging in and pulling was almost worse than the pain of getting shot. It raised its hand to its face, a small bloody chunk of me in between its thumb and forefinger, and ate it. I got a brief, horrible glimpse of its true face for a second. Rubbery, olive gray skin. Big, jaundiced eyes set deep in their sockets. A shaggy mane of coarse yellow fur. The thing squinted, cracked its neck, flexed its jaw. Its skin rippled, and when it went back to looking human, it wasn't Rebecca anymore. It looked like me. It stared at me with my own eyes, and it smiled at me, showing off twisted, sharpened versions of my own teeth. See, David? Nothing that was killed for the express purpose of being eaten.
For most people, living in a haunted house would be a nightmarish experience they would soon want to escape from. But as we learn from author Alyssa Ebersold, one woman discovers that her house contains the spirits of two young sisters. As such, she's filled less with fear and more with curiosity about what happened to those young girls. Performing this tale are Jessica McAvoy, Nicole Goodnight, and Erica Sanderson. So don't be afraid. There's nothing to fear past the bottom step.
At first, I could only hear the ghosts from down the hall. Their voices were ambient, faraway whispers, and most often they remained as such. At other times, they were infantile screams, cries, and laughter that echoed indistinctly through the corridors. I knew there were several, and I could hear their footsteps thumping down the stairs, rhythmic and descending like the low rumble of a passing train. Eventually, the voices moved about the house. They drifted aimlessly, calling only to each other in distinct childish timbres, but in indistinct conversations. As time went on, their voices matured to my ears, and their vagueness evolved into the giggles of two young girls and their parents. Their names were Olivia and Nicole.
Ted, you're it! No, you're it!
I could see them appear and disappear as transparent wisps and flicker like candles through creaking doors that opened and closed without a human hand. When their amorphous forms transformed into the shapes of the girls, I was able to tell them apart. Olivia was the youngest, with beautiful red hair braided into pigtails. Nicole was the elder, with straight brown hair that went down to her waist. The parents I hardly saw. Occasionally I heard the kids being scolded from what I suspected was the kitchen, but the girls lived their own lives in their bedrooms off the hall. They never meant any harm, the girls. All they ever did was play with one another. Sometimes in the night I could hear their ruckus before my sleeping pills would take hold. The padding of their feet creaked the floorboards, and I could hear their stifled, playful laughs through the walls. If their ghostly sneaking persisted, there would be the muffled scolding from their parents, and then the giggles would cease. They would retire to their rooms, one of which was mine, and they would sleep before I did. I could never touch them. They were intangible to me. I wondered what had happened to this family. I only ever heard the girls roam the distance between the foot of the stairs and the hallway. Once they reached the bottom step, their forms would vanish as quick as morning fog. I didn't want to speculate about their untimely end. It was never nice to do so, but I couldn't help myself. No one had told me of a fire or deaths in the house in recent years. There had been no break-ins. When my partner and I had bought the house, the real estate agent hadn't disclosed anything about haunts, murders, or deaths of any kind. Perhaps the girls had died elsewhere, and they had come back to haunt their childhood home. Perhaps it was a place of happiness and solace for them. Maybe it was the best they could do if they were to remain in limbo for eternity. I thought of these girls often, how young they were, how tragic their story was, whatever their story was. It saddened me, and without fail served as a reminder to take my antidepressants. The questions eddied around my brain as I lay in wait of sleep to consume my consciousness, at least until I took my pills to help me do so. I wanted to know what had happened to these young souls. In their ghostly forms, they showed no evidence of wounds, broken bones, bullet holes, or burn marks. They never seemed frightened of their parents, so a death caused by their parents, be it accidental or intentional, didn't seem likely. My worry for the girls and their presence eased my torturous loneliness as I waited for my lover to return from their long and seemingly infinite business trip. But all the same, in a sort of oxymoron, thinking about them, hearing them, and watching them pass through me like shadows made the constant ache in my chest deeper. I knew so little about the harsh truth of their terminus. I wanted to ask them, but ghosts don't know they're dead. There came a time when I drew up the courage to speak to the girls. It was a cold evening, or perhaps it was just their company. Whenever they were near to me in the past, I could sense the mercury line sliding down its tube, or at least I thought I could. It may have just been some kind of placebo effect, or a wild imagination drawing inspiration from horror films I had seen. How exactly could a ghost steal warmth? That never made sense to me. I sat and waited in the hall, letting the stillness surround me. I hoped they would reveal themselves on their own. I could hear the ambient clink of dishes and the din of faraway conversation. They would be finishing their ghostly supper soon, and their translucent forms would appear at the bottom step. They would effortlessly glide, in either their deadness or their youthfulness, up the stairs into their rooms to play. It didn't take long for them to appear. They first emerged as wisps, bounding gleefully upwards, taller, older, and more graceful than I had remembered. I could have sworn the youngest had been a toddler, or at least preschool age. I took a nervous breath and called to them. They looked at each other, confused, but continued on their way. I called again, louder this time, focusing all my energy on communicating. My shout must have been effective because they jumped. The lights in the hallway sputtered as if surged with power. A light bulb close to me popped as it burnt out in the commotion, and then they looked right at me. They were frightened by me, and they gazed at me with wide eyes, mouths slightly agape. I reached out to them reassuringly.
Hello?
Her sister huddled with her. I sat down on the floor, the boards creaking below me, and I looked them in the eyes as warmly as I could. How old were you? The younger sheepishly looked at me from behind a raised shoulder.
I'm 7. And I'm 12.
Olivia loosened the grip on her sister. I smiled, noticing the goose pimples on their bare arms. Did you go to school?
I do go to school. I'm in 3rd grade.
Oh, of course you do. I shook my head, feeling slightly foolish as I realized my mistake. Olivia told me how much she loved grade 3. Math was her favorite subject, but recess was her favorite class. Nicole was moving on to junior high at the end of the year. She liked learning about the presidents and ballet. I asked about their parents. What were their names?
Mama and Mommy.
Nicole gave a small smile.
Susanna and Eva.
According to Olivia, Susanna was a liar, but I suspected she meant lawyer. An oral idiosyncrasy from a small speech impediment I detected. My suspicions were eventually confirmed during another one of our chats.
Mama put a bad man in jail today.
Eva helped save people from dying at the hospital, but she wasn't a doctor. According to Olivia, she was like the patient's mommy too. She took care of them. A nurse, most likely, I concluded. Every night as I lay in my empty bed, desperately longing for my absent partner's warmth, I would say, "Sweet dreams," to the girls, and they would giggle. I took my pill to soothe my swirling thoughts of loneliness, and I would fall into a dreamless sleep, a likely side effect of my medications. I hoped they had dreams in the afterlife. The girls' lives were cut short due to tragedy. At the very least, they should be afforded wild imaginations and vivid escapes. Every day, I called out to the girls, and before they would notice me, the lights would pulse, and every day the girls would model their dress-up costumes for me and look just a bit older than the day prior in doing so, or tell me about the cute boys at school. The girls became my friends, my routine. I never did anything else or was excited for anything else, except to talk to the girls. One cold, rainy day, they did not appear for me, and their absence made me far more despondent than I'd like to admit. I waited for what seemed like forever for them to reappear. When night came, I curled up in bed and listened to the distant rolls of thunder and the rain gently pelting the window panes. The loneliness was unbearable without either the girls or my partner around for evening companionship. Without them to talk to, all I did was sleep. Simultaneously, I was so overwhelmed with that sadness in their absence, I found it difficult to rest, and I needed the comfort of an extra pill, or 3. Days went by without a glimpse or a sound of Olivia or Nicole. But one afternoon, I was stirred from a deep sleep by the hollow voice of a woman calling my name. It echoed, but I finally found its source at the bottom of the stairs. There, on the bottom step, stood a strange woman in her 20s with brown hair tied up in a bun. I sat down at the top step. Could the stranger be one of the parents? Or another ghostly resident? The ghost called to someone I couldn't see. I could never see the ghosts past the bottom step. Then she looked directly at me with a friendly smile.
Hi there.
Hey.
Do you not recognize me?
Why would I? She looked away from me past the bottom step.
I told you we weren't crazy, Liv.
A second woman materialized on the bottom stair, with long auburn hair tied back into a ponytail, and she too looked up at me in recollection. I stared them in the eyes, and was struck suddenly by their eerie familiarity. A chill went through me, and somewhere down the hall, I heard a light bulb suddenly shatter. Ghosts don't know they're dead.
We're long past the year of 1984, and although the dire warnings found in the book of the same name haven't quite come true, one can't help but wonder if we're closer than ever to a time where our mere thoughts could condemn us. In this tale from author Bruce Golden, we meet a man who has been punished merely for ideas and thoughts held privately, and whose punishment is, to say the least, extreme. Performing this tale with me are Graham Rowett and Mike Delgadio. So we can only hope our futures don't see punishments as severe as the withering. I lie here, as I have lain for so long, like a crumpled fetus, waiting for an end that will not come. I beg for it, I pray for it, but even as I wait for a cessation of my terrible existence, I know it is only a seductive fantasy. I imagine release, escape, blissful freedom, for imagination is all I have left. How perversely ironic that the cause of my damnation is now my sole salvation. The air reeks of disinfectant as it does habitually, and the only sounds I hear are distant murmurings. There's a chill in the air, so I clutch futilely at the lone coarse sheet that covers me, and open my eyes to the same austere wall, the same mocking shadows that greet me in perpetuity. This time, though, I see a slight variation. Something is there, something I can barely discern in the feeble light. A tiny, quivering wiggle of activity. I strain to focus and see a caterpillar laboriously weaving its cocoon. Somehow it has made the Herculean trek to where the wall and ceiling intersect, and has attached itself in the crevice there. As I lie here, I wonder what resplendent form will emerge from that cocoon. But even this vision is eventually muted by the despair that possesses my soul. I struggle not to reason, because there is no reason. Guilt or innocence, fact or fiction, they are concepts that no longer matter. All that matters are the gray ruins of my memories. Memories that play out across the desolate fields of my mind. I cling to them the way a madman clings to sanity. In truth, I'm but a single aberrant thought from slipping into the murky, swirling abyss of madness myself, so I try to remember. I remember the carefree excursions I took to the ocean as a child. The warm sand, the cool water, the waves lapping at my ankles. I remember the university in the days before Reformation, the camaraderie of my fellow students, the give and take of creative discourse. soaring over the sea cliffs on a crude hang glider built by a classmate. The girl with the bright red hair for whom I secretly longed. I remember many things, but always there is one tenacious, tumultuous recollection that intrudes. It's always the same thunderous sound of cracking wood as my door bursts open, the same flurry of booted feet violating the sanctum of my thoughts, the same rough hands that assault and bind me. I remember the looks of hatred and repugnance, the shouted threats of violence from unfamiliar voices. The relentless malice focused upon me was like a living thing. Time and space became a rancorous blur as I stood in the center of an imposing room, still bound, surrounded by more strangers. I was on display, the accused in a courtroom where only the degree of my guilt seemed subject to debate. Much of what occurred that day is lost in a haze of obscurity, but I clearly remember the prosecutor's embittered summation.
The facts are incontrovertible, Honorable Justice. A routine intrascan of the accused's personal files disclosed numerous writings, both prosaic and poetical in nature, which can only be described as obscene and disturbingly antisocial. Public decorum prevents me from detailing the improprieties here, though the complete volume of these degradations can be found in the articles of evidence. In addition to the possession of these heinous works of pornography, the accused fully admits to authoring them. I say he stands guilty of counts both actual and abstract. I request that no leniency be shown by the court and that he be sentenced under the severest penalties allowed for such crimes.
I distinctly remember the prosecutor, indifferent but confident, returning to his seat as the presiding justice contemplated the charges. The justice turned a stern glance towards me.
Does the accused have any statement to make before judgment is passed?
I remember standing there, befuddled by the ritual of it all, unable to accept the realization that this was my fate they were discussing. When it seemed I wouldn't reply, the justice opened his mouth to issue the verdict, and I quickly stammered the only thing I could think of. I admit I wrote things that may be considered inappropriate by some, but they were simply meanderings of a personal nature, never meant for public dissemination. In no sense was I propagating the enforcement of my ideals upon society. They were simple fantasies, scribblings of an unfettered imagination, nothing more.
Surely, throughout the course of this trial, if not previously, you have been made aware that, under our governing jurisprudence, thought is deed?
When I failed to respond, he went on.
And if you have nothing further to say in your defense, I rule, by law, your guilt has been determined within reasonable doubt. I hereby sentence you to the withering.
I remember the clamor of hushed voices swelling like a balloon about to burst as the words were repeated throughout the courtroom. The withering. The sound reverberated inside my skull, but terror and denial colored my reality. The withering. It was something spoke of only in whispers. No one I had ever known knew the truth of it. There were only rumors, grisly tales with no substance, yet the power to invoke dismay and horror. Much of what happened next is a void of innocuous bureaucracy, but I remember the room where it took place. I was still bound, this time by sturdy leather straps that embraced my wrists and ankles. Except for the straps, I was naked. Lost in the surreality of the moment, I felt no humiliation at my nakedness, but was overwhelmed by a pervading sense of vulnerability. I remember a chill in the room. There was a draft blowing from somewhere nearby. A single bright light was positioned so that it blinded me with its glare. 3 others were in the room. One I designated the doctor, and 2 men who assisted her. They went about their business with systematic efficiency, seeming to ignore my obvious presence. Then, without really acknowledging me with her eyes, the doctor began explaining the procedure. Paralyzed with fearful anticipation, I failed to absorb much of what she said. I remember only bits and pieces. Something about hormonal injections, osteo and rheumatoid mutations, effects which bypass the brain. The technical details of her explanation became a mere backdrop when I spied the rows of hypodermics. Its length extended beyond absurdity, and when she reached for the first one, I braced for the pain to come. However, after a few minor stings, I felt only a pinching sensation as needles were inserted with care into my thighs, my forearms, my neck, and on until each violation of my body no longer mattered. I must have passed out at some point, because when I awoke, I was in another place. I have no idea how long I was asleep, but as I weaned myself from unconsciousness, I felt a stiffness that convinced me I had been lying there for some time. I tried to move, but couldn't. I saw no restraints holding me down, so I tried again. I was successful, briefly, if you consider inducing a stabbing pain somewhere in my back a success. The pain convinced me to forego any further attempts at movement, so I shook off the vestiges of slumber and tried to recall with more clarity what had happened. Oh, that it could only have been a horrible dream. But my reality had become a nightmare, one I hadn't yet grasped in its fullness. I know now nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to learn. After I lay motionless for some time, a white-coated attendant approached me and bent over to engage in some sort of interaction with my bed. Where am I? What's wrong with me? Why can't I move? The attendant made no sign he heard me. Instead, he pushed my bed into a corridor that stretched on without end. The wheels churned below me as we passed cubicle after grim cubicle. In the dim light, I saw other beds occupied by inert bodies. The shadows and the constant jog of movement prevented me from seeing more until we came to a halt. The attendant departed, leaving me as naked and helpless as the day I was brought into this harsh world. The alcove where I had been left was much brighter, and it took time for my eyes to adjust. Unable to turn my head without great pain, I could look in only one direction. Facing me was a metallic wall or door of some sort. The metal sheen was highly reflected, and in its mirrored surface I saw myself. Rather, I saw what I had become. I have no idea how long I screamed before my cacophonous lament attracted a swarm of attendants who quickly sedated me. But I'm sure I wasn't the first or the last to wail in terror inside those somber halls. I try not to remember what I saw in that hideous reflection, but I can't forget that my fingers are now gnarled deformities, my arms shrunken and folded against my chest as if my tendons had shriveled. I know the slightest attempt to move my legs will cause indescribable agony that writhes up through my hips and assaults my spinal cord. I can try to forget that my once wavy hair has been shaved to a coarse stubble, but the feeling my lips are dry and cracked is ever present, and too often my skin is aflame with a devilish itch I cannot scratch. Warehoused like a spare part that no longer serves any purpose, my days passing into years, I suck sullen gruel through toothless gums and wait for the impersonal touch of an attendant to wipe my body clean. Oh, it is a morose whim of fate indeed, that even such routine maintenance is a welcome diversion to an otherwise monotonous subsistence. Trapped in a useless husk, perched on the precipice of lunacy, I turn inward for deliverance. From a place deep within, I rise and soar high above the other lands, gliding lazily into other times. They don't know of my journeys. They think I'm a prisoner of this room. They don't know I become other people, bold people, curious people, people who commemorate their adventures in rhyme. I don't tell them about the rhymes or the improper thoughts that creep into my head. I still dare to imagine the unimaginable, but no one knows. They won't find me in here. In here, I don't allow myself to dwell on past transgressions. I seek no pity nor submit to reproach. And no matter how seductive its siren call, in here I resist the longing for sweet death. Instead, like the caterpillar, I wait to emerge from my cocoon, spread my glorious wings, and fly. In our final tale, we meet a man fresh out of university with a strong desire to travel. But as author Jeff Miller shares, choosing to travel in Eastern Europe left the man trying to find lodging that offered a bit of the comforts of home. He was able to find just that sort of place, but with so much more. Performing this tale are Atticus Jackson, Aaron Lillis, Ellie Hirschman, and Jesse Cornett. So remember to take lots of photos when you travel. That way you can end up with the wall of smiles.
It's funny how the worst moments of your life often begin under mundane circumstances. I was 23 years old, and as early 20-something numbnuts tend to do, thought the world was mine for the taking. Fresh out of university, I sought to broaden my horizons by backpacking across Eastern Europe. It was something I'd always wanted to do, and knew if I went straight into the 9-to-5 world, I would never make the time for it. My mother was naturally concerned that I would never be seen or heard from again when I told her I had decided to make the trip solo. Clearly, I would end up dead in a ditch or trapped in some kind of torture porn like that one horror movie. This was the year 2014. Smartphones were a thing. GPS was a thing. What could go wrong? People could disappear, but I wouldn't. My first destination was Amsterdam, because of course it was. Remember, cliché dumbass 20-something. My trip started out fantastically. The sights and sounds were wonderful, with more than enough girls, weed, and booze to go around. The red light district lives up to its debauchery-fueled reputation. Definitely recommended. But after 13 straight days, even sex and drugs began to lose their luster just a tiny bit. It was time to move on. I had a decent chunk of money saved up for the trip, but it would only sustain me for so many weeks, and there were still other countries left on the agenda. Germany is incredible. You have never truly had beer until you've been handed a pint in a hole-in-the-wall pub in Frankfurt. Poland proved meh. I only spent a handful of days there, mostly just observing the countryside during drives throughout the day and struggling to locate motels at night. I guesstimated that I had enough resources to stretch out one last day in an adjacent country I'd yet to visit before begrudgingly booking that first flight back towards Rhode Island. I decided on Lithuania. Why? I have no fucking clue. Maybe because no one ever talks about visiting Lithuania, and it would prove to be a unique place to talk about when people ask me about my travels back home. On this matter, I was painfully correct. Nightfall descended a couple hours after crossing the Lithuanian border, and I decided to spend my last batch of excess funds on a decent locally operated homestay I found on the Airbnb app. It only had a handful of reviews, but the ones I skimmed were all positive. Username Kathy F47 declared that Miss Jensen's home away from home is an absolute delight. You'll never want to leave. And who was I to argue with Kathy F47? Plus, it's not like there were a shit ton of options to choose from in the tiny village of Kalpinalaus. Having pinpointed Miss Jensen's home away from home using my phone's GPS and the app's check-in feature, I parked my rental in the makeshift inn's lone designated parking spot. I departed my car into the chilly Eastern European air and quickly gathered my bags as the lightest of snowfalls drifted upon my face. I paused for a moment to take in where I'd be staying the night. The building looked to be in remarkable shape considering the state of the village. Most of the other units looked like they easily could have been the setting for an old black and white Dracula thriller. But not Miss Jensen's place. A steepled roof draped over auburn sidings that I could just make out in the dark. The house's single chimney billowed out a soft trickle of smoke from a fire that I could visualize even before stepping inside. Pointed arch windows symmetrically adorned both the first and second floor exteriors, and Gothic arches laced the front entrance. Azure glow from a flickering neon sign above the door luminously proclaimed vacancy, which oddly perturbed me. Why would a homestay in the middle of nowhere Lithuania have a sign written in English? I decided to brush aside the thought, as the place did, to Kathy F47's credit, appear fairly inviting. I walked to the front entrance, pausing to read a smaller sign that was posted above the door's mail slot. It boasted perfect handwritten penmanship, like the professionally reproduced kind you'd see on a Hallmark card. Welcome to your home away from home. No longer must you roam. Come on in. Don't be shy. You'll never want to say goodbye. Jay. Well, that's not creepy at all. Suddenly, the thought of staying under the same roof as the chick who puts rhyming couplets on her front door sounded less than ideal. And I turned around, strongly considering a retreat to my car so I could seek out an alternative place to spend my final night abroad. But just as quickly as the thought had occurred, a bone-chilling gust of wind blew across the Lithuanian streets. It seemed to usher me towards the walls of Miss Jensen's. Fuck it. I gripped the lightly frosted doorknob, twisted, and entered. I crossed the threshold of Miss Jensen's home away from home, bringing with me a slew of snowflakes from the violent winds outside. Shaking the elements off my jacket, I wiped my feet against a pristine welcome mat and looked around. The place was definitely unique in its decorations, as the furnishings appeared simultaneously modern and archaic. A nook with a tray of impeccably fresh fruits stood off to my right. To my left were a matching set of olive green chairs and love seats resting opposite a high-definition television, playing what I assumed was the local news. An anchor spoke in Lithuanian, and while I had learned a bit of German and French in college, I didn't understand a lick of Lithuanian. Yellow knitted throw blankets were perfectly folded and laid upon the top of the small couches. The foyer's most striking feature, however, was the wall between the sitting area and check-in desk. Covering it from floor to ceiling were identical and intricately designed frames, each one precisely placed an inch apart in measured rows. It was an impressive sight that I couldn't help but investigate. Since no one was waiting for me at the desk, I sat my bags down near the door and walked closer to the photos. Expecting a series of local attractions or news clippings to be housed within the frames, I was surprised to instead discover that each photo was a Polaroid selfie taken with a wall of photographs serving as the backdrop. The sight created an almost kaleidoscopic effect, with every image capturing who I assumed was each person or family that ever visited the homestay. People from all sorts of nationalities adorned the images, each one smiling goofily for the camera. In the white strip below each picture, that same beautiful calligraphy that had covered the sign outside boasted the names of the occupants. Jason, 2013. Emily, 2008. The Clarks, 2005. There were hundreds of them, all surrounding a vibrant plaque in the center which proclaimed the name of the art project in purple block lettering. The Wall of Smiles.
Enjoying my photographs?
The question startled me out of my trance, and I 180'd immediately towards the source of the voice. It was the woman holding the camera in all of the wall's photos.
Yes. It's very unique and cool.
My heart was still beating rapidly from the scare, and I felt once again like an idiot tourist who was well outside of his element.
It's my favorite pastime.
The woman walked around the check-in area to join me by the wall. She seemed to glide effortlessly across the room. Her jet black hair was perfectly held up in a 60s-esque bun, with not a single strand loose. Horn-rimmed glasses covered gentle green eyes. I could not, for the life of me, even begin to guess her age. She possessed that long-gone aura of beloved and iconic actresses from eras past.
There's something beautiful about a photograph.
Now standing next to me, her perfume wafted my direction, a slight hint of raspberries and peaches. It was then that I first noticed she was wearing a necklace with an old-fashioned bronze key dangling at the end. I couldn't tell if it was an actual key or just ornate jewelry.
People never stop growing. The person you are now is not the same person you were 5 years ago. You constantly change, be it for the better or for worse. 1 minute you're fine, and the next, heartbroken. But these smiling faces, they are the best of what we aspire to be. Eternally happy, frozen in a perfect moment.
A smile of her own beamed as she looked proudly upon the wall.
I'm impossibly rude. I never introduced myself. I am Miss Jensen.
She extended a hand along with the introduction, and I took it.
No, you're fine. I'm Alex. I checked in on the app. The reviews spoke very highly of you and your, establishment.
A look of shock flashed across her face.
Oh, you poor thing, you're freezing. We'll fix that shortly. But first...
She darted back to her desk to grab something. Quickly returning to my side, she revealed a Polaroid camera. She leaned in close enough for me to get a fresh experience of raspberries and peaches. I reacted just quick enough to form an awkward smile.
Okay, now that's settled. Follow me.
Walking back to the door to retrieve my bags, I joined her back at the front desk. Curiously, she didn't use a computer, instead preferring a paper registry like the ones that hosts in upscale restaurants used in movies. She quickly glanced at her papers.
Ah, yes, Alex Matheson. I've got you down right here.
Another of her intoxicating smiles appeared as her gaze met mine, but it quickly evaporated into a frown.
Aw, I see you're only staying for one night. That's a shame. I think you'll find your home away from home unforgettable. Follow me and we'll get you all set up in your room.
Great. Thank you so much.
Miss Jensen sat her registry back upon the desk and entered the hallway with me in tow. The walls on each side were fashioned with the standard pictures one would expect to see in hotels. A Monet replica here, a generic countryside there, nothing close to as memorable as the wall up front. We approached a closed door at the end of the hallway, and Miss Jensen raised her necklace above her head to insert the antique key into the lock. A wave of welcoming heat washed over me as the door opened. The fireplace that had been churning out the smoke I'd seen outside was located inside the guest room. Taking a step back to allow me room to enter, I walked in, sat down my bags at the foot of the bed, and looked around. Flames crackled beneath the beautiful mantel off to my left. No expense had been spared when it came to the sheets, smoother than any I'd felt in my entire life. There was a wall-mounted television opposite the bed, and a small dining nook was set up off to my right. It was all pretty goddamn wonderful, I had to admit, and worth much more than the reservation had cost.
I'm assuming you're hungry from your trip?
Absolutely starving.
You just make yourself at home, and I will have room service delivered here shortly. How does rosemary braised lamb shanks sound?
Perfect. Thank you again. This place is pretty amazing.
She grinned at the compliment.
I'm glad you think so. Your food will be here soon, and I'll see you in the morning. Enjoy your stay, Alex.
Just as Miss Jensen promised, the food arrived about 20 minutes later, but I never did see who delivered it. After hearing 3 knocks at the door, I walked over and opened it, expecting to be greeted by either Miss Jensen herself or perhaps an attendant who helped her run the homestay. Instead, I found a rolling serving station, complete with a bottle of wine and the promised lamb shanks. The food was delicious. It was during my meal that I started to realize something that had been bothering me in the back of my mind. Miss Jensen's accent, or lack thereof. Why didn't she have an accent? It's perfectly understandable to see why a person running a bed and breakfast would want to learn English and be able to communicate with tourists, but why wouldn't she have some hint of an Eastern European accent? And what was up with that wall of creepy-ass photos? Further adding to the confusion was the juxtaposition of just how incredibly nice and likable she was. So many things seemed off, but she wasn't one of them. She gave off nothing but friendly vibes. Was her physical attractiveness clouding my judgment? The question continued to roll around in my head as I finished my meal. I elected to shrug off the thought as best I could. It was just one night, and I was probably just being paranoid. I set off for bed. It wasn't very late, but I was exhausted from the drive and now full of carbs. Sleep came easily. Sitting up in bed with a jolt, I squinted through groggy eyes to find out what had caused the noise. It was the doorknob. Caught somewhere between fatigue and alertness, I was waiting for what felt like an eternity to hear if the doorknob would rattle once again. Nothing. Whipping the covers off my lower body, I crossed the room, placing my right ear against the door to see if I could hear anything else through the wood. At first, the hallway sounded perfectly still. What sounded like 2 voices having a hushed conversation back and forth permeated through. What they were saying was too faint to make out, but what interjected their back and forth was unmistakable. The giggles of children.
Hey, who's out there?
Did Miss Jensen mention that she had kids? I didn't remember it coming up in conversation. Odd that she didn't at least have photos of them around or something of the sort.
Fucking kids.
Rubbing my eyes out of frustration, I returned to my bed and pulled the covers back over me. Sleep was almost within my grasp. Fed up and drained, I tossed the blankets aside and went to the front door to tell the kids to please quiet down. I gripped the door handle and...
What the fuck?
I waved my hand back and forth to shake off the unexpected sensation that exploded from my thumb and fingertips. The throbbing quickly faded into numbness, and instinctively grabbing my fingers with my other hand, I realized why. They were ice cold, as if they had been submerged in snow for far too long. Reaching blindly across the wall with my uninjured hand, I eventually found the location of the light switch. The overhead lights appeared, practically blinding me in my half-asleep and freaked-out state. When my eyes finally adjusted, I observed the doorknob. It looked completely normal. Unable to fight off my curiosity, I tapped the doorknob ever so slightly. It was still unexplainably and almost painfully cold to the touch. Retrieving a shirt from my duffel bag, I wrapped it around my hand, opened the door, and entered the hallway. Except what I walked into was no hallway at all, and the sight was so unnerving that I forgot all about the freezing doorknob. I was now standing, impossibly, in the middle of a daycare that should not have been there. Its surrounding walls were so decrepit that I felt like the roof above could come crashing down at any moment. Educational posters teaching children their ABCs and numbers hung in tatters from tacks. Black mold had overtaken the room's entire foundations. The stench was overpowering. I held the shirt against my face to mask the rotten smell. It barely made a difference. Layering the floor were dozens of broken children's toys. Their bright and flashy coloring as faded and worn down as the room itself. They were the generic sort that must have been decades old. Minuscule footprints tracking all across the floor, however, had managed to retain their color. The bright crimson of fresh blood. This was the point where all the attempted rationalizations began rumbling around my head. I had to be dreaming, right? Bullshit. You know reality when you see it, and smell it, when you feel it. This was real. Fuck. The food. I was drugged. That's it. That Miss Jensen bitch wanted to fuck with me and snuck some crazy shit into my food, and I was tripping some major balls right now. Bullshit. I knew what drugs felt like. I tried just about every one of them under the sun. This was no drug. This was really happening. And I was terrified. Fear brought with it focus, though. The time for questions would be later. All that truly mattered at the moment was getting the fuck out of whatever hellscape I was standing in. The sound of footsteps returned, along with it the children who made them. 2 kids who couldn't be older than 5 or 6 years old appeared a few feet in front of me, stopping dead in their tracks. They were clearly surprised to see me, but not as horrified as I was to see them. Their appearance was the fabric of nightmares. Both of them were irreparably burned and had no business being alive, let alone running around and playing. Charred skin covered their entire bodies. Black bits of scorched flesh and tattered sections of their clothing had crumbled away. It looked to be the remains of old school uniforms. The boy on the left was missing his right arm from the elbow down, while the other child didn't have enough features remaining on his head to qualify as a face. The boy without an arm broke the silence.
Are you our new babysitter? Miss Jensen didn't tell us you were coming. She usually tells us when we get a new babysitter.
I froze for a few seconds before finally responding.
No. I'm sorry. I'm not your new babysitter. I'm just visiting.
Oh, okay. We don't get many visitors. Well, outside of Miss Jensen herself.
So is Miss Jensen your usual babysitter?
The other boy with the destroyed face tried to answer, but was unable to form any coherent words.
It's all right, Bobby. I can talk to him. If you're a visitor here, you should know what Miss Jensen's job is. You're starting to make me think you don't really belong here. That would be bad. We don't want Miss Jensen to get mad at us again. Could you leave, please?
Yeah, totally, kid. I can leave. I just don't know the way. Could you show me where the exit is?
The space where his left eyebrow used to be raised in confusion.
Bobby and I can't leave. That would make Miss Jensen very angry and...
He looked down at his charred visage.
That would be bad. Please leave now.
Just point me towards the exit. I promise I can...
Jolting backwards, I shielded myself with my arms against the two masses of fire. Aromas of melting skin and bone fragments boiling within the fire's raw intensity filled my nostrils. More hunks of flesh dripped from their bodies as the sweltering heat became unbearable in an instant.
Please! She's hurting us because you tried to take us away from her!
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
Expanding at an alarming rate, the flames forced me back into my room. The door abruptly shut on its own accord with a smash that rattled the hinges. Screams from the little boys echoed for a few more seconds, and then silence reigned. Staring at the back of the door, my breathing erratic and out of control, I struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. The fire had been so violent that my entire room should have been overtaken by now. But it was like the fire in the daycare had never happened at all. I almost caught my breath when the doorknob turned by itself and slowly creaked open. Frozen in place, I was unable to move. After some time, flight went out over fight. Nope. I ran and slammed the door shut. Shaking off the coldness from the knob again, my eyes darted all around. I was going to get the hell out of this godforsaken place. That's when I realized that my room had no windows at all, no other exits whatsoever, and my cell phone had zero service. There was only the door. I only had one place to go, because I sure as shit wasn't staying there. I grabbed my car keys and phone, threw on my coat and shoes, and elected to leave the rest of my belongings behind. Standing in front of the door, I reached my hand in the direction of the knob.
Fuck me.
It took more tries than I'd like to admit to finally muster the willpower to open it. I had to force myself all over again to continue forward, to try and find an escape out of my home away from home. I opened the door the rest of the way and headed into whatever awaited me beyond. The daycare had been replaced with a dimly lit infirmary of some kind. Instead of the smell of burnt flesh and mold, I was now overcome by the sterile scent of hospitals and chemicals. Flickering fluorescent light tubes above illuminated my surroundings every few seconds, giving me mere glimpses of the new horrors below. On each side of the room, ancient hospital beds with raggedy restraints were bolted to the off-white walls. The room had been kept in better shape than the daycare, but it was by no means inviting. Dirt, grime, and cobwebs saturated the floors and ceiling corners. Used syringes and rusted bedpans were scattered all over. Scratchy yellow-stained pieces of fabric were crumpled beneath unbuckled restraints. I took a step forward.
What? Who's there?
I jumped at the unexpected shriek. One of the beds still contained a patient. Still completely strapped into his restraints, he jerked violently. I inched closer to get a better look. His raspy voice had foreshadowed his feeble physical state and emaciated frame. Skin lesions and bed sores marked his entire body on the sections not covered by his filthy hospital gown. The restraints were a cosmic joke at this point, as I don't think he would have been able to run away had he been free.
Please, help me. Nurse Jensen will be making a round soon.
A brighter flicker from the lights overhead revealed a better look at the patient's face. The top of his head was covered in sweat and blood-streaked bandages. Pools of dried plasma had seeped out of where his eyes were, or maybe used to be. An out-of-control gray beard drooped all the way down to his torso. I refused to let the man suffer the same fate as the two boys, and I still needed a guide out of this place. The man had to know more about this place and Miss Jensen than I did.
My name is Alex. I'm gonna get you out of here. Just let me get these harnesses off you.
I began unbuckling the man's restraints. Easier said than done, as the tethers were old and tattered. After the seventh one, he was free.
Oh, God bless you, Alex. My name is Hudson. Do you have any water?
Helping him to his feet proved easier than I thought, as he couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds in his withered state. He understandably couldn't stand on his own, so I threw his right arm over my shoulders, supporting his weight.
Nice to meet you, Hudson. I'm sorry, but I don't have any. Do you know the way out of here? Maybe we can find you some water on the way.
I don't know. It's been so long and I don't remember much of anything beyond this room. But we must hurry. She is never gone for long.
Miss Jensen is a nurse here? Seems she gets around. Who is she?
She's whoever she wants to be. She runs the asylum here. There used to be more people with me. She took them one by one. I never saw them again. Then she took my eyes. And I never saw anything again.
We took a few steps towards the infirmary's closest exit, which stood opposite my room. Instead of a standard frame, double swinging doors hung loosely from their hinges. I propped Hudson against a nearby wall and pushed one door just wide enough to peek through. The hallway was also in disarray, with flashes of light only illuminating the walkway every few seconds. After a couple of minutes of not seeing or hearing anything, I braced Hudson's arm over my neck again. We crept through the doors as silently as possible. The slog proved a slow one. After several minutes, we didn't encounter any surprises.
How long have you been here?
I have no idea. I probably don't want to know. My friends and I, we were checked into the asylum when ours became overpopulated. Nurse Jensen was kind enough to reach out to our hospital, offering us a place to live in her homestay 2 towns over. She was nice. Until she wasn't.
She just took ownership of you guys that easily? Don't they have, permits or something for shit like that? It's 2014, for Christ's sake.
Hudson stopped moving for just a second, and then continued alongside me.
It's 1921 where I come from, son. I was curious where the hell you got those weird clothes.
I wasn't sure how to reply. Typically, I would have assumed he'd gone crazy after being locked up for too long. After the freaky shit I had seen over the last few hours, though, I couldn't rule out the possibility he was telling the truth. I told myself the answer really didn't matter. All that mattered was getting out. Hallways just led to other hallways. We had been moving for what felt like hours, with no progress at all. The odd part was that it never seemed like we were going in circles, as all the infirmary's hallways we found ourselves in appeared ostensibly unique.
Oh my, Alex. It seems you've gone and caused some trouble tonight, haven't you? And made a friend. How sweet. I guess it is your first night under my care, though, and you haven't been taught all the rules yet. So I'll make you a deal. How does that sound?
The bitch knew where we were. We needed to move.
How about you eat my dick, Miss Jensen?
Look at the potty mouth on this one. You are quite the character, Alex. But in all seriousness, it's not polite to just go and take other people's things. Return my patient back to his room immediately, and I'll escort you back to yours with minimal punishment, Oh, I know. I will only remove that filthy tongue of yours. Do we have a deal?
That's really tempting, but I think I'll just be leaving now, thanks. If you could kindly direct us to the exit, that'd be fantastic.
All right, have it your way, sweetie. You should have taken the deal.
Run! Picking up our pace any further was almost impossible with Hudson with me. We had been traversing the asylum for hours, and if I was exhausted, I knew the frail man must be close to passing out. Come on! The footsteps were growing louder by the second. We were running out of time.
I'm trying!
Struggling onward, the stampede of pursuers couldn't have been more than a hallway or two away now. We weren't going to make it. For a moment, I'm ashamed to say I considered leaving Hudson behind. On my own, I might have been able to outrun whatever was chasing us. I'd probably feel like a real shitbag for life, but I could potentially still be alive enough to regret it. I never got the opportunity to form my decision. I couldn't help but glance back to finally see what was hunting us. The sound of their trampling pursuit was deafening. I couldn't see anything. They weren't obscured in the darkness. They simply weren't visible at all. The running stopped. Hudson was wrenched from my grasp with a force powerful enough to almost send me flying. His feet pulled out from under him, and his chin bounced painfully off the grimy linoleum floor. I could only watch in terror as his shriveled body was dragged backwards at breakneck speed.
Help me! Help! Help me!
His scream was cut short as bloody punctures began appearing all over him. Holes and tears emerged in his hospital gown, crimson soaking the cloth in waves. Blood began pooling all around him as the wounds kept on appearing, even after his death. Eventually, the stabbing stopped. Human footprints of various sizes appeared in Hudson's blood, heading in my direction. I froze, unable to run, unable to move, unable to even speak. I awoke from my traumatized trance and bolted for the hallway behind me, barely noticing that the swinging doors were frigid. I surged through and leaned my back against it to brace against the attackers. Their weight clashed against the double doors like a tidal wave. I leaned back with what little strength I had left. After a couple more failed attempts, the attack stopped, and I was greeted by silence once again. That was the moment I realized I was no longer in the infirmary. Gone was the desolate atmosphere of the daycare and infirmary. Surrounding me was a typical office, very much like the various counselors' workplaces I had visited during enrollment each year at college. The office was impeccably clean. Several filing cabinets occupied the wall off to my right. A couple of identical brown bookshelves stood to my left, with what appeared to be a set of old encyclopedias resting on one shelf. Various other reference books populated the others. The far wall was oddly bare, with not so much as a poster tacked up on its light brown surface, or a windowsill to occupy the space. A desk that could have belonged to a high school principal dominated the center of the room. Papers, sticky notes, and office supplies covered its top, all perfectly organized. No computer sat upon it, only an intercom microphone. And sitting behind it all in a rather luxurious office chair was Miss Jensen.
Well, hello there. How's life treating you?
She beamed that intoxicating smile of hers. She waved at an empty wooden chair oriented to face her in front of the desk.
Have a seat.
I didn't react at first and just stared at her, my breathing erratic as I tried to calm myself. Then, doing as instructed, I walked a handful of paces over to the chair and sat down. Miss Jensen's clasped hands rested upon her desk, and she sat with her back perfectly straight. I felt like I was at a job interview.
I told you, you should have taken the deal. Poor old Mr. Walker would still be alive had you just done what I asked.
It took me a few seconds to realize she was talking about Hudson.
I really don't enjoy killing my toys, especially ones I've had as long as Mr. Walker. They begin to hold a sort of sentimental value after a while.
She grinned again. I still said nothing.
You're disappointing me, Alex. Where's that feisty young gentleman from earlier who so lovingly told me to... Now, how did you put it? Eat a dick? I like the ones that put up a fight. That's why you're sitting across from me right now. The ones that simply run and hide, they're so dreadfully dull, they would never be worthy of the honor of visiting my office.
Words crept from my lips, but they felt hollow, as if being spoken by a different person. Who are you? What are you?
Now why, oh why would I go and tell you that? And spoil all the fun? The mystery's always much more powerful than the answer, isn't it?
She stood up and walked around the desk, resting against the front side of it off to my right. The scent of peaches and raspberries drifted over me again.
Regardless of what you might think of me, I like to consider myself a pretty fair individual. I could do what I said earlier and remove that dirty little tongue of yours.
She reached down and pinched my cheek, shaking it slightly like a grandmother would tease her grandchild.
But I'm going to let you decide your fate today. Either selection you make, however, will end with the same conclusion.
Lifting herself off the front of the desk, she positioned herself behind me. Resting her hands on the top of my chair, she leaned close enough to whisper into my left ear.
You'll grow to think that this place isn't so bad after all, and that I'm excellent company.
With a snap of her fingers, 2 doors appeared on the previously bare wall. Each was identical, matching the one I had seen at the front entrance of the home away from home. A moment that felt like it had occurred an eternity ago. Miss Jensen pointed a finger at the one to my left.
This one leads you back to your room at my homestay. We will forget all about tonight's transgressions, and you will live out your existence where you belong, under my care. You'll eventually find you rather enjoy being a full-time member on the Wall of Smiles.
Her fingers switched directions to the other door.
Then there's this one. You'll find yourself standing outside my front door. You can take your car back to your worthless little life, to a perpetuity of never mattering, of never truly being happy, of everything you will ever possess never being enough, of always wanting more.
I looked back and forth at each door several times. What's the catch?
There's no catch, sweetie. Just 2 choices. One is happiness. One is disappointment. For the both of us.
Promptly standing up, I headed for the exit and rested my hand upon the doorknob. I turned back to look at her. Confidence disappeared from her posture for the first time since I'd met her.
You're breaking my heart. I only ever wanted to make you happy, Alex.
I turned back towards the exit. Walking through, I calmly shut the door behind me. The familiar Eastern European air flushed across my body, and a chill crept up my spine. I was on the front porch of Miss Jensen's. I ran towards my car quicker than I'd ever moved in my life, Fumbling with my keys, I finally opened the door, clambered in, and made my way for the Lithuanian border as fast as my car could take me. After 5 flights and 4,000 miles, I sat inside my car in the driveway of my parents' house in Rhode Island. I hadn't really been able to sleep during the 3 days since Miss Jensen's. Hopefully being back in my own bed and near family would help me rest, and I could begin the process of putting what I'd experienced in the rearview mirror. Speaking with my parents would probably be difficult. How do you tell someone something you know they won't believe? My mother, knowing I dabbled in recreational drugs from time to time, would declare the whole thing an acid trip. But I knew it was real. It was all real. 2 days before, while waiting at the airport to board one of my flights, I Googled Hudson Walker. The search wasn't easy, but I found him in a missing persons database that populated its files with out-of-date systems and old newspaper clippings. Hudson Walker, born March 14, 1865 in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He had been reporting missing by his family in the winter of 1921. Forcing the thoughts of Hudson and the nightmarish circumstances surrounding my memory of him from my mind, I grabbed my bags and headed up the path to my parents' front door. With a sigh of relief, I planned to go in and give my mom and dad the biggest hug I could muster. They would blame homesickness for the random embrace, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong. I grabbed the doorknob, and my heart sank into the furthest depths of my stomach. It was ice cold.
Amen. As our service concludes, we send you away with our blessings. Visit the nosleeppodcast.com for show notes and more details about the people who bring you this production. And on their behalf, we thank you for being a supportive, sleepless member. This audio production is copyright 2018-2019 by Creative Reason Media, Inc. All blessed rights reserved. The copyrights for each story are held by the respective authors. No duplication or reproduction of this audio program is permitted without the written consent of Creative Reason Media, Inc.